Hey everybody, Crow back again with a look at another Evercade game cartridge. This time we're looking at the Atari Collection 2. If you don't know what the Evercade is this handheld device right here. Takes these game cartridges, and in this case we got 20 games from the Atari 2600 and Atari 7800. It's mostly 2600 games. And what I usually like to do is I talk about each one of these games briefly, and I will give it a ranking from 1 to 5. A 5 being what I feel is a great game, a game that I definitely will be coming back to play again and again. 4 being a good game. This is a game that I will still come back and play again and again, but may have some issues that I feel could have been fixed. A 3 is what I consider to be an okay game, a game that I may go back and play, but I'm kind of on the fence as to whether or not I would consider it a good or a bad game, just kind of down the middle of the road kind of deal. A 2 is what I would consider to be a poor game. This is a game that I really don't like, but I feel may have some merits to go back and play again. And a 1 is what I would consider to be a bad game, a game that I would just not want to go back and play for any reason whatsoever. Also keep in mind that the rankings I'm giving these games are the games being played on the Evercade and not the games on original hardware, so there may be some limitations to the Evercade that may affect the score, like the lack of a 2-player option. And a lot of these 2600 games are in fact better with 2 players, so you may see some scores get affected because of that. And also these are all just my own personal opinions. I'm not going for a common consensus here. This is just me and how I feel about these games, and no further thought than that. So with all that being said, we got 20 games to get through here, so let's start with the first one. Game 1 is Air-Sea Battle for the Atari 2600, originally released in 1977, and this is just primarily a very basic target game where you're either turrets on the ground shooting at targets in the air, or you're a plane in the sky shooting at targets on the ground. And we're kind of off to a bad start here, but not because I think that Air-Sea Battle is a bad game. In fact, it was one of the games I really enjoyed playing with my sister back in the day, and that's the problem. This game is way more fun when you're playing against another person. On the Evercade, you're forced to just take control of one turret while the other one doesn't do anything, and you're basically just trying to go for your own high score. Now, the game does have game modes that are single player, where the computer takes control of the left turret and just continuously fires, and that would give you some competition. However, the Evercade controls are mapped to the left turret, so you actually can't do anything in the single player game. And because the single player games are absolutely unplayable, I'm going to give this a 2. It ultimately just winds up being really boring, just competing for your own high score again and again and again. Game 2 is Asteroids for the Atari 7800, which was originally released in 1986. Now in Atari Collection 1, we had the Atari 2600 version of Asteroids, and in Collection 2, we get the far superior 7800 version, which doesn't attempt to replicate the looks of the arcade game, but gives it its own spin where the asteroids are, well, literally spinning. I didn't really mean to phrase it that way, but I did, I guess. But yeah, you get your typical game of Asteroids, and it's fun. It's a really good version of the game, and if you're somehow not familiar with how Asteroids is played, you are a ship that flies around shooting the asteroids. They break off into smaller asteroids, making things a little bit more chaotic, and you basically clear the level by shooting all the asteroids and move on to the next level. And sometimes a UFO comes out and shoots at you, and you have to shoot back. That is it. It's as simple as that. It's a fun game, really fun in fact. I find really no flaws with it, so I'm going to give this a 5. Game 3 is Basketbrawl for the Atari 7800, originally released in 1990. And I was really mixed on this game. When I first started playing it, I was playing it like a regular basketball game, and I was like, I don't know if I really like this or not. And then I decided to go around and start punching people, and that's when I was very surprised to find that you can literally, well, not literally, but at least knock your opponent unconscious to the point to where they cannot compete anymore and they just lie on the ground lifeless for the rest of the game. So then I avoided going for the ball whatsoever, let my computer-controlled teammate take care of the ball, while I focused on just punching the opponents down until only my team was left, and we would just shoot baskets until time was up and we'd win by like over 100 points or so and just continue that way. Of course, you also have to avoid the characters on the sidelines throwing knives on the field, and I was having a great time with this game because I thought it was hilarious that you could do this. Unfortunately, it just keeps repeating and goes on and on and on, and it kind of does get kind of boring. So at first I went from wanting to give this game a 2, and then I wanted to give it a 4. But it's still kind of mediocre once you get past the fact that you can knock the opponents out and just shoot hoops until time runs out. So ultimately, I'm going to give this one a 3. I'm kind of on the fence about it. I kind of do like the game, but I just can't give it a 4. All right, game number 4 is bowling for the Atari 2600, and the Evercade says this was released in 1984, but I don't think that's correct. I'm pretty sure it was released in 1978, so that's just one of the typos I think that is in the Evercade. But anyways, this is a game I used to play a lot when I was younger, and it's just your standard, typical, basic graphic bowling game, but I still liked playing it. And with bowling, you're pretty much stuck with 3 modes. One mode where you can only roll the ball straight, one mode where you could roll the ball, but when you hit the direction, the ball curves in that direction, and another mode that lets you steer the ball once it's released. And when I was younger, I used to like playing the mode where you could just steer the ball because it was far easier. But these days, I prefer to play where you can curve the ball. You basically just roll the ball and try and time it, try to angle it in for a strike, and I find that a little bit more challenging. But ultimately, that's really all there is to the game. I do really like the animation of the bowler when he gets a spare or especially a strike. That never gets old for me. But ultimately, I've got to give it a 3 here, just an okay game, because there's nothing really compelling me to come back to this to play it again and again. But it could be a good time waster if you don't want to play anything too intense. Game 5 is Centipede for the Atari 7800, originally released in 1987. And here again, we have another game where the 2600 version was released on Collection 1, but the 7800 version is released here in Collection 2. And if you're not familiar with Centipede, you're basically a turret on the bottom of the screen that can move side to side and up and down to a limited extent on the lower play field, all shooting at the centipedes and other bugs that are floating around the screen and just trying not to get hit, and especially trying to avoid the centipedes from hitting the bottom of the screen, because then they'll kind of work their way back up and even more of them appear on the screen. You also have the mushrooms to contend with, and scorpions and poison mushrooms, and it is just a really basic game, and the 7800 version of it is certainly no slouch. And again, this is another game where it may not be exactly like the arcade game, but I really have no faults with the 7800 version, and there's no issue with playing it on the Evercade as well, so I'm gonna go ahead and give this one a 5. Game 6 is Dark Chambers for the Atari 2600, originally released in 1988. And this is a dungeon crawler, very similar to Gauntlet. In fact, this was also released on the Atari 7800, where it looked very much more like Gauntlet than this does, with its big, giant, chunky graphics. This is an okay game, I feel. It's just really hampered by being really slow and very technically limited. I think they were just pushing the Atari 2600 just a little bit too hard here. Again, like I said, an okay game, but it's very slow and plodding. I'm just on the fence of this one. I mean, it's amazing what they did with the 2600, but did this game really need to be on the 2600? Especially in 1988. And as such, I'm just totally on the fence with this one. You're just going from room to room. You're looking. It's very slow. Yeah, I'm not that too into it, but I wouldn't say it's a bad game. So I got to rate this one a 3. Game 7 is Demons to Diamonds for the Atari 2600, originally released in 1982. Now, I think a lot of people start playing this game without actually knowing what you're supposed to do, but you are in control of the red cannon at the bottom of the screen, and you are shooting at the red demons, and the longer you hold down the button, the longer your laser blast goes. When you hit the red demons, they turn into diamonds, and when you shoot the diamonds, you collect more points. Now, if you accidentally hit a white demon, it turns into a skull and crossbones, which will randomly fire down or up the screen. Now, the reason why they sometimes fire up is because this game could have been played originally with 2 players, where the second player would take control of the white cannon shooting at the white demons, but on the Evercade, it's only a single player game. And I also have to mention that the original game used paddle controllers, and the game is a little bit more fun with the paddle controllers. However, I gotta say that the game is still equally fun with it converted to the Evercade's D-pad. So yeah, I just have a blast with this game. I think it's incredibly fun, and I've gotta give this one a 5. Game 8 is Desert Falcon for the Atari 7800, originally released in 1987. And immediately when I first saw this game, I thought to myself, well, this is just another take on a Zaxxon. The only difference is that you can land your Falcon on the ground and collect items, which can lead to obtaining power-ups. But ultimately, I'm left a bit indifferent on this game. Now, the Atari 2600 version of Desert Falcon was on Collection 1, and I really didn't like that version of it, but this one is better. It's much more playable, I feel. But at the same time, I'm just really indifferent about this game. With some effort, I can get past the first level, but honestly, even when I did have this game for the actual 7800 hardware, I was never really into this game. So I just gotta give this a 3 because I don't think it's a bad game, but at the same time, I just don't see myself coming back to this one that often. Game 9 is Human Cannonball, originally released for the Atari 2600 in 1978. And this is just a really simple game where you just try to make some adjustments to a cannon so that when you fire, the human cannonball lands in the water tower. And there are a ton of different game modes in this. Some game modes where you're only allowed to adjust the angle. Some game modes where you're allowed to adjust the angle and move the cannon. Some game modes where you can only adjust the wind. Some game modes where there's a barrier in your way, and so timing is a factor. There's just a lot of different options here, and I consider this to be a fun, simple, just sit down and think about it kind of game. No hurry, just take your time and then fire. And then every time you fire the cannon, some variables change and you have to make some adjustments and you see if you could do it again. Now, I do have a bit of fun with this because I do enjoy games of this type. And honestly, I can see where some people might find this game boring, but not me. If I'm in the right mood, I would love putting this game on and just firing the human cannonball a few times to see if he lands in the water or not. And I'm going to give this one a 4. Definitely not a great game, but I think it's better than okay for what it is. Game 10 is Haunted House, originally released on the Atari 2600 in 1978. This is a game where you play a character who goes into a haunted house and tries to avoid the bats, spiders, and ghosts while trying to retrieve the pieces of an urn. I don't know if this urn is magical or what is the purpose of this. You're just trying to collect an urn and then escape the haunted house without losing all of your lives. That is it. Now, this is a game I remember playing when I was really, really young, and I was actually really scared of this game, but it's kind of laughable to think that anybody would be scared of this game nowadays. When you get hit by one of the ghosts or creatures, you know, the lightning and everything. I just love that effect. It's just hilarious. And nowadays, I feel that Game 1 is just way too easy, but also Game 1 is the only one that allows you to see the walls. All the other game modes take place place in the dark, so you really can't see the house walls, and I don't know what the reason for that is, but to be honest, if I were to play this game now again, it would be on everything except game 1, just because I feel that's too easy. And yeah, I really do think that this is a fun game. I don't think it's great, only because I feel like there could have been more game modes where you could see the walls, so I gotta give this one a 4 for sure. Game number 11 is Millipede. This is the Atari 2600 version, originally released in 1984. And this is the follow-up to Centipede. Pretty much the same premise, where you're a little character at the bottom of the screen firing up, firing through mushrooms to hit all the segments of the centipede, all the while other little critters are attacking you. There are some improvements in this game, such as additional creatures and DDT spread upon the playfield, which will explode in a puff of gas, which will eliminate anything it touches for a limited amount of time. Now, what I find interesting is that the Atari 2600 version of Centipede is on Atari Collection 1, while the Atari 7800 version of Centipede is on Collection 2, this collection. And then they wind up putting the 2600 version of Millipede on Collection 2. So it's kind of weird that in this collection we're getting the 7800 version of Centipede, but the 2600 version of Millipede isn't on the same cartridge as the 2600 version of Centipede. All that being said, this is a fun game despite the really blocky graphics. If you could get beyond the graphics, this is a fun game, and I'm going to give this a 4. Game 12 is Planet Smashers, released for the Atari 7800 in 1989. This is a shoot 'em up that I gotta admit I didn't really like at first, but the more I played it and the more I figured it out, it actually has some pretty interesting things going on. Basically, the premise of the game is that you are defending the Earth. If you notice, the Earth has a shield, and if that gets completely depleted, you do lose the game. But ultimately, you are going to be collecting power-ups to increase your shield. So yeah, you could take a number of hits. One hit doesn't kill you instantly. And also, you can collect cloak power-ups, which if you hit the button, you become invisible to the enemies. But the most interesting thing is that you won't get to the boss of each level until you figure out the correct combination of colors to collect. And then when you do, that's when the boss appears. Now, I gotta admit, the bosses are pretty damn difficult. That is something I feel needed to be worked on. The bosses are just relentless in this game. But what you really need to do is make sure your weapon is powered up significantly before you attack the boss if you hope to stand any chance against it. And oh yeah, when you first start this game, you don't even have auto fire. And that is the first weapon upgrade, is auto fire. I thought that was pretty damn weird in itself. But yeah, ultimately this did wind up being a fun game. But yeah, with many flaws that really should have been looked at before release. So ultimately, yeah, I gotta give this one a 4. This one actually turned out to be more fun than I initially thought. Game 13 is Radar Lock, originally released for the Atari 2600 in 1989. Yes, this is a very late Atari 2600 release, and pretty much just is like Afterburner or Top Gun, but only downgraded for the Atari 2600. And I gotta admit, although this game does seem to play fairly well, I'm not a big fan of a lot of these really late release Atari 2600 game, because I feel like they're trying to make the system bite off more than it can chew. Yeah, you fly, you can shoot the enemies, and there's even a refueling sequence, but ultimately I'd like to play something like this on a more capable system. I also need to mention that this game actually requires 2 joysticks to play on the Atari 2600. One joystick, you're flying, you're shooting, and the other one lets you change your weapons. So this being the Evercade, you only have one controller. You can't switch your weapons away from the guns or anything else unless you use up all your guns and it changes automatically. But that is a hindrance to this game as well. And because of these issues, I gotta give this one a 3. Yeah, it's not bad or terrible or anything, and it's still playable, but I just think that this is a little too advanced for the Atari 2600, and you're losing features on the Evercade by not being able to switch weapons. Game 14 is Realsports Tennis, released on the Atari 2600 in 1983. This is just a pure and simple tennis game, and quite possibly the best one on the system. It's just a plain and simple tennis game that plays a lot like Pong, as most of these tennis games did way back in the day. This even has advanced features like putting your name in. But yeah, I kid. This is just a fun game to play. You basically run, the guy hits the ball automatically. You have a choice between fast or slow speed, perhaps by a glitch. And this is the same glitch that happens with a video pinball on Atari Collection 1. But if you accidentally hit the left trigger, it switches it to difficulty mode B, where you do have to hit the button to swing your racket. And this is obviously an oversight because none of the other games allow you to change the difficulty switches for the Atari 2600 games. So I don't know why this allows you to switch it. And once you switch it, you can't switch back without exiting the game. So there's an oversight there. That may be something that's corrected in the future, but ultimately I really enjoy Realsports Tennis, and I'm going to give this one a 5. It's just pure, simple, fun to play. Game 15 is Submarine Commander, originally released on the Atari 2600 in 1982. And this was a game I'd never played before, and it had me a little bit worried because the genre of game, the Evercade says this is a simulation, and I was like, oh boy, how complicated is this simulation gonna be? And it turns out it's not really a simulation at all. Well, it kind of is, but it's more of a look up and down and fire missiles at boats that are flying by and get the highest score you can before time runs out kind of deal. There are a bunch of instruments on the play field that I didn't really figure out how to use most of them. There are some instances, torpedoes, that you must avoid yourself, if I'm understanding correctly. But ultimately, there are several game modes, all of them, increase in difficulty. They change what the enemy will do, but you're just firing at big, giant, blocky boats. And that's okay. And that's what I feel about this. It's okay. I'm going to give this one a 3. I neither hate it nor really like it. It's just right in the middle for me. Game 16 is Sprintmaster for the Atari 2600, originally released in 1988. And this is just an overhead racing game, very similar to Super Sprint. Well, that's what it reminded me of. In fact, it probably is a derivative of Super Sprint and the Sprint series as a whole, and it doesn't really fare too well on the Atari 2600. Again, this is another one of those games that I feel where the 2600 was biting a little bit more off than it could chew. Not necessarily just the overhead racing part, but adding in the obstacles and the power-ups as well as all the tracks. And it's not that the tracks aren't bad or anything, it's just that I think you need more detail than what the Atari 2600 can offer in this respect. You also have the option of 3 different road variants per each track. And honestly, the game is hard enough without having to worry about dirt and ice, so I usually just stuck to the pavement. But you're also given the option of whether or not you just want to crash into the walls or you want to bounce off of them. And why in the world would you choose to crash into the walls? Because you'll be hitting those walls a lot, and you'll probably explode like 500 times. This game is not easy to control is what I'm trying to say. And since this is the Evercade, you don't really have the option of playing against another player. You're relegated to racing against the computer. Honestly, this game is kind of a tough sell, but at the same time, I don't think it's a bad or a poor game. But on the other end, I wouldn't say it's a good game either. So I'm just right on the fence with this one. I'm going to give this one a 3, an okay rating. Game 17 is Solaris, originally released on the Atari 2600 in 1986. This is a space shooter game where you go around shooting asteroids and enemies, picking up and rescuing stranded humans. At least that's what I'm guessing you're doing. But also you kind of choose where you want to go from spot to spot on the space grid. And a common thing that I've been saying for some of these 2600 games in this collection is, well, it seems like the game tried to bite off more than it can chew for the Atari 2600, and it seems like Solaris would fit in that category. But honestly, it all works. The graphics look great, the effects are really good, and the game is fun to play. I haven't quite figured out all the little details about the game, but it is fun to go back to and try and play again and again and see where you could go on the map, what happens trying to rescue the humans. It's just a great game, and it works somehow on the 2600. So I'm going to give this one a 5. This one's great. Game 18 is Street Racer, originally released for the Atari 2600 in 1977. This is one of the oldest Atari 2600 games, and boy does it show. This is just basically a collection of games where one player is on the left side of the screen and the other player is on the right hand of the screen, and you're kind of traveling down a road. In some of these mini games, you're a car that is dodging other cars. Sometimes you're a skier trying to ski through the openings in the wall. It's pretty much the same type of game again and again and again, and they all have pretty much the same problem. They start out way too slow and then they get way too fast because the graphics are so huge you really can't dodge anything when you're going at a high speed. I was never really a big fan of this game, and on the Evercade there's a bunch of marks against it. The first being that this was originally a paddle game, so you don't get the paddles with this. The other is that this is really meant to be a multiplayer game, so there's really 2, 3, and 4 player variations, and on the Evercade you're really stuck playing by yourself. I mean, you could go for a high score, but it's really not that fun. So I gotta give this one a 2, just very poor on the Evercade. Game 19 is Wizard for the Atari 2600, and this was released in 2005. I don't know the exact details why so late. I mean, I'm pretty sure this is some sort of homebrew. Maybe it wound up on an Atari flashback console or something like that. But when I first booted up this game, without reading the instructions, I had no idea what the hell was going on. So I managed to track down some instructions, I read up on it, and the basic premise is that you're a wizard trying to defeat some sort of swirly vortex of evil. You have to obey the rules of the maze, you can't walk through walls or anything, but the swirly vortex of evil is invisible most of the time, and it can go through walls, and it will always move towards your direction. However, you can hold down the fire button, charge up a shot, let go, and the shot will automatically fire towards wherever the swirly thing of evil is. So basically, this amounts to you running around the maze, shooting, trying to determine where the evil is, and getting a clear shot out in the open and avoiding its shot, and the first one to go down wins that round. And if you get killed, it's game over, and if you defeat the evil swirl, you move on to the next level where things get even harder. To be honest, I thought this game was really fun. I had a good time playing this one. So I'm going to give this a score of 5. A great game. Our 20th and final game is Yars Revenge, originally released on the Atari 2600 in 1982. And this is a game where if you didn't know how to play it, you'd be really confused. But basically, the little bug-like creature flying around the screen is your character, the Yar. Your mission is to break down the wall of the enemy, which I don't remember what the name of it is at the moment, but you break down the wall, you basically touch it or touch the other side of the screen, and that makes a missile appear on the other side of the screen. You hit the fire button again, and it fires at your location, so you've got to dodge out of the way and hope it hits that main bad guy that that's kind of floating up and down the screen. And all the while you're trying to do that, there's a little bit that's kind of floating around the screen that's constantly chasing you, meaning you've always got to be moving. But you can take refuge in the safe zone, the flashy little strip that's in the middle of the screen. But while you're in there, you can't fire. So it's safe zone for everybody, I guess. But yeah, this is a really fun game once you really get into it. This is a game that's kind of grown on me over the years because I kind of remember not really liking this game at first, but it gets really fun. Now, in Atari Collection 1, there was Yars Return, which I did not like very much. It was basically a modified version of this game where you had even less room on the screen to maneuver, but this original game here is excellent. I'm going to give this one a 5. That's all 20 games for Atari Collection 2. If we look at the scores I gave the games as a whole, you can see that I didn't give any of these games a bad score, and only 2 of the games I gave a poor score. A whole 7 games I was on the fence about. 4 of the games I thought were good, and 7 of the games I felt were great, and that gives this a total average of 3.8, which is significantly better than the scoring I gave the Atari Collection 1, but is in fact lower than all the other cartridges I looked at so far, which have been the 2, 3, and 4 cartridges. So that's gonna wrap it up for Atari Collection 2. The next game cartridge I'm going to look at for the Evercade is probably one of the more popular ones, and that is a Namco Museum Collection 2. So I can't wait to get started looking into that and making a video for it. So with that being said, I'll see you all next time. Bye.